Good afternoon, everyone. For those of us that are watching us, I have joining with me this afternoon, Emil Wilbekin, who is the founder of Native Son. Emil, how are you doing today?
I'm so good, Heaven, and just grateful to be here in this space with you today.
So good. So we're gonna, with that
Yeah.
so good energy, we're gonna get right into this interview. Emil, throughout your career, you have really been leading, writing, creating, and at the intersection around activism, culture, business style, and honestly, so much more. And so, in every role that you've had throughout your very long and extensive career, which is an amazing career for those of you guys, please check it out. But you've championed the voices of the LGBT community. Can you share how your experiences and the work that you've done over the past years, how has it in these spaces, how did it birth the vision of Native Son?
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, it really started at my very first job out of graduate school. I was an assistant at Metropolitan Home Magazine, which I don't even think exists anymore.
Mhm.
And I was also in the process of coming out and or inviting in, as everyone says now. And so at work, in my mind, I kind of lived in these two compartments of being out in public, but not being out at work.
Mm,
And luckily, it was a queer friendly space. They had done a lot of work around HIV and AIDS, and this was in the middle of the AIDS pandemic. And they also had a lot of queer people on staff. And so they encouraged me to be my full, authentic self at work. I took that and ran with that. So I carried that with me through my whole professional career, from going to Metropolitan Home to being a founding editor at Vibe. Um, and then again, working in a very queer, affirming space where I was encouraged to be authentic and not just my being and my identity, but in the work that I was creating. And so I took that also into Essence when I worked there. They have a history of doing LGBTQ and HIV and AIDS coverage. And they allowed me to bring my full self into that space. So all of those things, I think the period at Essence was the most impactful because I saw how Black women were lifting each other up, supporting each other, empowering each other, nursing each other, helping each other. And I thought, gosh, I wish we had something like that for Black, gay, and queer men. And I literally be in these events crying. And
right.
so it just kind of was like an assignment that was placed on my spirit to create this community and grow it and build it based on my own experiences being a Black, gay, HIV positive Black man. And the fact that I knew in the community, in my friend circle, at my church, and other areas, other men were going through the same things and needed that support, needed to see themselves, need to be reflections of themselves.
Wow, that's powerful. It's great. It's oftentimes our own, experiences, our narratives, right, that jumpstart our purpose.
That's right.
And yeah, that jumpstart our purpose and create and the work that you've been able to do is almost a connector, right? Because now you're bringing folks together and developing that community. How have you seen the work of Native Son be able to develop and create that community?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think, I started Native Son 5 years ago. We're going into the 6th year. And I started it on social media with nothing, right? With just like putting up these posts of iconic Black gay men and putting Native Son behind it. And now, going into our 6th year, we're at 47,000 people on Instagram. And so that just shows you the power of, to your point, representation, seeing ourselves, seeing reflections of ourselves, seeing that we're worthy and that we're enough. When we were doing events live and in person pre-pandemic, at the events, I did the very first dinner. There were only 50 Black, gay, and queer men, intergenerational, but there were no plus ones. And people were like, well, I don't want to come alone and I want to bring someone else with me. And I was like, you're going to know people in the room and you may not, but I
Right.
want you to come alone because you have to be able to step through that door by yourself and feel whole and enough in yourself and be open, right, to meeting your brothers who you don't know. And it just, even that small thing was huge. Don Lemon was so grateful to be in that room.
Wow.
People heard me come out about my HIV status in that room, who just this past year came out about their status because they were inspired 5 years ago hearing that testimony. So those are small things. I think the bigger things, effects of it, Heaven, are like the DMs that I get from
Mm,
people that are living in countries where it's illegal to be queer, people who are in their 50s and 60s who still live in the closet that want to come out because of the impact of Native Son. And then just the connection of friendships, of mentorships that have come out of the community of Native Son. I mean, it's too many for me to list, but those are just some of the examples of how just creating a community to support each other activates the love and humanity within each of us.
I love that. It activates the love and humanity inside each and every one of us. And so I think this is a great kind of segue into my next question is, the current landscape around sort of related to messaging, right? So we have the work of Native Son, which
Mhm.
occupies a particular space in sort of this
Yes.
area around messaging, whether, in media and in all these spaces. So what would you say is your current assessment, right? Of
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
landscape as it relates to messaging, access to resources, and representation for Black queer men?
Mhm. So we're living in an interesting time because we just posted the Native Son 101 list, and it's 101 Black, gay, and queer men who have had impact in 2021. We did it in 2020 as well. And the most interesting thing about that is it was a struggle to cut it down to 101. There were so many across disciplines who had had impact in Hollywood, who had had impact in politics, in activism, in literature, in music, in art. And the thing that is, when you talk about messaging, it's sad to me because we are literally hidden figures. We are,
Yeah.
yesterday we celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday, and I always raised up Bayard Rustin because Bayard Rustin was his lieutenant, was Martin Luther King's lieutenant. He
Yeah.
was someone who really helped with A. Philip Randolph put together the March on Washington. And many people don't know he infused Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement with knowledge about nonviolence and
Mhm.
Gandhi and all of that, that really shifted when Martin Luther King made the I Have a Dream speech. We're still in that space. When people see us, they see Black men first, and then they might see that we're gay, queer, or non-conforming. So what happens to that is we're ignored.
Mm.
We are literally rendered invisible. And so the work of Native Son, and there are other local organizations that are doing great work, is how do we have a voice and a visibility? How are we seen and heard
Right.
aside from in a few movies as a sidekick on TV? You don't, as many Black, gay, and queer men who are doing such powerful work, we're still super marginalized. Like we're marginalized within the marginalized. And so I think that's why it's important that we have more platforms out here that really amplify the voices and the humanity and tell the stories of Black, gay, and queer men because we lost a whole generation during the AIDS crisis. It's
Right.
called the lost generation. So we lost a whole generation of storytellers, activists, advocates who really were keeping the tradition, the griots of our community, and they're gone. And so now we have to rebuild and replenish that because those men need to be recognized for their works, the James Baldwins, the Marlon Riggs, the Essex Enfield, all these men who did all this great work, Alvin Ailey. We have to hold them up, but we have to hold up the present people who are doing the work and inspire the next generation to be more vocal, to not be afraid, to really live their lives out loud. So there are very limited resources, and a lot of the resources focus around HIV and AIDS, but they don't focus on holistically the issues that plague and concern Black, gay, and queer men.
And I would love for you, if you can, what are some of those challenges, right, and those things that you're seeing,
Mhm,
and what are the struggles that Black queer men are facing that are different, right, from what has
mhm,
happened years
mhm,
ago? Now that there is representation, you have more folks that are choosing to be out and
mhm.
speaking. Um,
Yes, yeah.
and there was something that I kept thinking about, because as you
Mhm,
mentioned this idea around how you were finding that, you shared this list and you had, but there's still hidden figures, right? So what
mhm,
can we be
mhm,
doing to create that space for folks
mhm.
to feel like they can show up as their full self?
I think to answer your first question, what are the other issues that are relevant to Black, gay, and queer men? So I would say number one is mental health. Mental health is a challenge, particularly, I think, going into the pandemic. Mental health for everyone is challenging. Mental health in the Black community is a struggle. It's a challenge. We don't talk about it. A lot of people want to pray it away. They don't want to believe that it is a real issue, and we kind of ignore it, right? And
Mhm.
so, oh, they're just crazy. And it's like, you can't use that language, right? So, mental health in the pandemic has been exacerbated because you have isolation, you have people that can't be out the way they used to. Our social systems have all shifted, and you can't really be with family the way you used to. And a lot of your support systems socially have broken down. So, mental health, I think, is a big challenge. I often talk about the trauma that we live in as Black men, because as Black men, we're still dealing with health disparities, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of unemployment. We're dealing with higher rates of police brutality and social injustice. All of those things still affect us, even more so as Black, gay, and queer men. And then we have to deal with the identity part, right? So we're moving through a world that already is shunning Black men. And then here we are like, oh, I'm gender nonconforming on top of that. So there's issues of shame and stigma and non acceptance from the world, but particularly in the Black community and particularly the Black church. So there's a lot of trauma and pain, and all of this. There's a lot of molestation and sexual abuse and assault that we don't talk about,
Mhm.
that we just turn a blind eye to. So once you layer all of those, mental health to me is definitely the biggest. I think the other things are representation, seeing examples of yourself in the media. I think that there's issues around professional development, because there's not many people who have made it, who are successful and who are out, that can then bring along the next generation.
Exactly.
And then there's just, the other things that we as a Black community are dealing with right now in COVID. We're harder hit by COVID. We're dealing with insecurities around housing, employment, food, shelter, safety, just safety, right? And so the other part of the question that you ask about is like, now that there's so many more Black and queer men who are out, what are they dealing with? Well, a lot of them have to deal with navigating in either all white spaces, white corporate spaces, or all Black spaces where they're not necessarily accepted. So a lot of times people, I often think we have a privilege when we live in these big cities, that we can be out and we can live our lives authentically. And people, if they want to wear a skirt or lipstick, they can.
Right,
That's not an option. That's a privilege. If
right.
you live in certain parts of the South or other rural areas or urban areas, your own safety and the safety of your family is at risk. So these are all the other issues that we're kind of dealing with as we just move through the world.
Wow. It's so interesting when you hear people, speak, and how much identity really impacts the way that you navigate certain things. And that what you just said is
Yeah.
privilege, right? Because living in New York, I see so many folks really walk into their identities, live into those identities.
Yeah.
And you don't often think about
Mhm.
those folks in the South, right? In the rural South, who don't have the option
Yeah.
to be their true full self.
No.
And what
No.
type of, to your point around mental health, what type of impact does that have when you cannot be yourself,
Mhm. That's right.
um, and not showing up? Which I think, leads to that second question that I asked, is that what can
Mhm.
institutions, right, from what are some potentially some things that can be implemented, things that you potentially did,
Sure.
what you saw, that will
Mhm.
allow for Black queer men to show up or feel comfortable enough to show up as their self in these workspaces?
So I think a lot of the work that I kind of lean into with Native Son, and I think is very critical, is kind of self-actualization work.
Mm.
It's identifying the issues within the body of the community and how do we heal, create healing, right? Because if we create healing, then the community is stronger, right? If I see that my brothers are going to seek therapy, are able to invite in or come out to their families, or accepted in their church, or can go to work and say, hey, I'm gender non-conforming and I'm accepted. The more we see that, the more strength and sustenance we're giving to the community. So to create those spaces, we have to create those spaces, right? We have to create spaces where, just like in essence, Black women could come together and support each other. We have to have gender nonconforming and queer friendly LGBTQ spaces where people can come and can meet other people and hear their stories, but also be able to express themselves and to tell their stories in a safe space where there is kind of social workers or therapists
Right.
present that can help them kind of identify some of the issues that they're feeling and share those as a community, to say that we are okay, we are enough, and we can go out and face these demons and these things that are keeping us down and holding us back.
Right. And the other part about it is those of us, that consider ourselves to be allies, right? What are we doing in that space to be able
Yes,
to also create? Because the onus should
that's
not
right.
be on, Black queer
That's
men to
right.
feel safe, right? We need to make sure that we're doing
Yeah.
the work that whatever space Black queer men walk into, that when they decide to share their story, that we
Yes.
created a space for them that feels safety. And I think it
Hmm.
goes back to what you just said, right? It's all about
Hmm.
humanity and making sure that people
Yes.
feel and see one another's humanity.
So I'm so glad you said that, because literally that is the work that I believe Native Son needs to do moving forward this year. Is, when we talk about HIV and AIDS, when we talk about identity, it should not be isolated. It should be with the whole Black community, because I think ensuring that mothers are educated, right, about their sons or their brothers or their uncles, um, ensuring that Black cisgender straight men,
Right.
right, understand identity and
Yes.
understand that the nuances of what it means to be gay, queer, and gender nonconforming. And then also the conversations that need to be had in the church, the conversations that need to be had in Black neighborhoods. How are we making sure that people feel safe? But that's for Black gay men, but that
Right.
also includes trans folks, disabled folks, the elderly, veterans. All of us need to feel whole and accepted. Women need to be respected and treated as women and not misogynistic, and they shouldn't be in these patriarchal situations. A lot of the work that needs to happen is, how are we enlightening and creating a more brave Black community?
Yeah. And I want to actually ask a question, because you touched on the trans community, right? Oftentimes they get lost, right, within the LGBTQ
Mhm.
conversation. So how has
That's right.
Native Son really kind of done the work to make sure that trans people feel included in the conversation,
Mhm.
when we talk about
Mhm.
writing queer identity?
Well, I think for us, allyship is super important. And so, Black women, Black trans folks, all of these communities are part of the body of our community. And so we're so grateful. Like, I'm so grateful when, Janet Mock and Laverne Cox or Raquel Willis, Angelica Ross, how we can support them. I think Pose was a really great example of how we are a community and a family. We need to have more conversations. We need to invite each other into those conversations so that we can support each other. I have a friend, Amara Jones, who is a trans activist, and Amara and I meet and really talk about, how can we help each other, right? How can I help you? How can you help me? And I think we need more of that. I think it's super important. I'm really inspired by the trans community because they mobilize like no other, and they are unapologetic about who they are and showing up and advocating for the victims in their community, but also for the warriors in their community. And I think that that is super important.
Yeah, just having conversations sometimes, just, and I like what you said, what you share with what you do, is sometimes it's not about, right, just these big policy ideas and shifting. Sometimes it's just about one-on-one conversation that shifts
Yeah,
you internally. And so
that's
needing to
right.
do more of that. So I'm going to ask my final question, which is related because you talk a lot about Black queer men's health. You mentioned this idea. I mean, you mentioned that, there are, HIV, people who have HIV status. So I can imagine that there were some challenges, right, for Black queer men's health as it related to the pandemic, right? And so what were some of those things that you saw that were either being elevated or potentially marginalized as it related to Black queer men's health throughout this pandemic?
So at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the biggest issue were with the elders in the community who had survived through the AIDS crisis, who, even if they were coming of age during the AIDS crisis or witnessed any part of it, a virus that was coming around that was killing people and no one knew what it was very triggering, especially for Black, gay, and queer men who are single, who live alone, who are living with HIV in the middle of COVID. We had no idea what this virus was going to do. So we're already living, 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men is living with HIV in the United States, according to the CDC. So that's half of our community. So so that was the first part of what
Right.
was
Yeah.
happening. The second part was living in isolation, right? How do I get my meds? How do I have connectivity to other folks? And a lot of people were asking me, what if I die in my apartment and no one knows that I'm there by myself? These were the things that were going through people's minds. The other thing is healthcare. I remember one of the first people that died in the pandemic was a friend of mine who basically went to the hospital and they said, "You're fine, go home." He went home and he died. A lot of people showed up and didn't have insurance. And so they were terrified because how are you admitted into a hospital? You don't have insurance to get treated and maybe put on a ventilator, and you can't even afford insurance or don't have insurance. How are you going to afford the health care? Right. And then even if you do make it through, you're going to need support afterwards.
Yeah.
So that was another big challenge. I think the other part goes back into the mental health part of the isolation. We're dealing with so much stigma and shame. I commend a lot of the NGOs, particularly in the South and in more rural areas, that really stepped up and created support groups to let people know they were okay, to check in with them. But it's very scary. Now, the studies that I've seen, I don't know that people living with HIV or AIDS were more impacted worse than other people who didn't have HIV and AIDS.
Right.
But we did see overall Black people in the United States were hit harder because we also have to factor in, heart conditions, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, all these other underlying factors and morbidity that we live with really kind of impacted the mortality rate.
Right. And so because of that, were you seeing that there were folks that were more eager to get the vaccination, or are you still seeing a sense of vaccination hesitancy? Because we know that, just if you're to what you're, with the story that you share with
Mhm.
your friend who,
Mhm.
went to the healthcare system thinking that they could trust, right? So we still have that
Right.
sense of mistrust, right?
Yes.
Within the healthcare system that still really, as a Black person,
Mhm.
regardless of identity, you still feel that.
Mhm.
So what has sort of kind of
Yes.
been the conversation around vaccinations within the Black queer men's community?
So within the community, I think I would say a majority raised their hands to get vaccinated because they felt like, I'm already HIV positive. I'm already on medication to keep myself alive. Why wouldn't I take the vaccine? Of course, there's other parts of the community that are like, no, it's the medical mistrust. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. And now it's very interesting with the different variants because people are vaccinated and they're still getting sick, right? So it's a catch-22. For the most part, most Black, gay, and queer men really raised their hands and said, I want to get vaccinated because it's just another form of protection. And I'm already living on medication that I have to take daily. What is a vaccination going to do? Right. But there is still a lot of medical mistrust. I think a lot of people are still afraid, but I think we're in this weird phase where people are like, I don't know if I can keep living this way. And so that's why we see what's happening with Omicron and with all these different variants. People are like, I'll just take it and get the bad cold and get those symptoms. But, to see the surge that we experienced in New York around the holidays is scary because it kind of triggers you back into, are we going to have to go back into lockdown?
Yeah.
So it's the same. I would say the conversation mirrors the Black community overall. You have pockets that are definitely want to get vaccinated because we're dying at higher rates. But then you have another group that is like, no, I refuse. And I have friends and people that I know that still are not vaccinated, and I pray for them because it's scary that they've made it through, and maybe they're asymptomatic. I don't know, but God bless them because it's still scary to me.
Yeah,
and I'm vaccinated and boosted.
Same here, vaccinated and boosted. And it's almost like at this point, it's inevitable. It's like, it feels like the common cold and the flu. But what you just shared, right? The surge in over the break, right, was reminiscent, and you felt that sense of PTSD. Are we going back into 2020? What's going on? And the consistent the communication, right, and information, right, and it's just consistently negating one another. So that sense of safety. But what you share with us today is going to be helpful for those, in positions of power to be able to think about critically, right? How do we support the queer community and Black queer men over these next couple months? Because we're still in this pandemic, and I don't.
That's right.
Don't really see an end at the moment.
Right. And to your point, I just want to add really quickly, PTSD, we got to deal with that. There's so much trauma that we've all experienced collectively that we have to deal with now. If we're going to stay in this, it becomes an endemic, or if we are coming out of it, like people are traumatized, and we've got to think about that from a mental health perspective of collective healing for everyone.
Yeah. We had a conversation within our one of our communities, and then they talked about that, right? This collective need that we just, what we do as a society, we just want to keep moving on, we keep pushing forward, but not realizing, that there's so much unresolved trauma that we are carrying from season to season, and in order for us to be our best selves, right, we need to continue to do what you just said, the healing work, right?
That's right.
So, thank you so much, Emil. This has been a wonderful conversation, and just looking forward to just more conversations that we can have around Black women, so that we can continue representing, having them being represented in these important spaces.
Thank you. And thank you for including us in this conversation. I appreciate it.